Okay, ladies and gentlemen, before we jump into the patterns of inheritance that don't follow Mendel's three basic principles, the ones that kind of are outside the norm of what we talked about, I want to talk to you a little bit about the importance and the balance between your DNA and the genes that make it up and the environment in which you're raised. On the screen is an experiment that I conducted back in Pittsburgh. I grew two of the same exact plant. Okay, I got these seeds from a self-pollinating plant that was a purebred, meaning it'll always make identical copies. So these seeds are identical genetically. On the right, I grew those plants in the dark, and on the left, I grew those plants in the light. Despite them being genetically identical, their environment actually influenced the genes that were expressed and what were not expressed. And you can see that in their phenotypes. They look drastically different. So gene expression is always going to be the interaction of genetic potential with the environment. Okay, now we have so many genes that make us up, right? But it's our environment that will dictate the expression of some over others. And I kind of described this genetic experiment here. A seedling may have the genetic capacity to be green or to have flowers and fruit, but will never do these things if it's kept in the dark without exposure to sunlight. Just like a tree may never grow tall if the soil is poor or water is unavailable. Okay? You could say the same about ourselves, right? We may be genetically gifted muscle-wise, but if we never exercise or work out, we're never going to know that, right? We're never going to use that genetic potential. So, in other words, the presence of the gene is not all that's required for expression of that trait or phenotype. The gene must be present along with the proper environmental conditions. I stress this strongly. The phenotype of any organism is the interaction between genes and the environment. Just a little caveat there, folks. I think that's very, very important for us to keep in mind as we kind of get really DNA driven in this unit, which is not a problem. Okay, so let's talk about this first pattern of inheritance. It doesn't exactly follow Mendel's rules. We call it incomplete dominance, or you'll also see it written as non-dominance. So, all traits basically are not so clear-cut as dominant and recessiveness. Although there are some that are, some genes actually appear to blend together, right? Rather than seeing a clear-cut definition between this one is dominant over that one, we see a blending of genes and a blending of phenotypes. And the blending of these phenotypes is what tells us that this is incomplete dominance. So, let's look at an example. We have these red snapdragons, which is a type of flower, crossed with these white snapdragons. Now, if red was dominant to white, all of the offspring would be red. If white was dominant to red, all of the offspring would be white. But if they are incompletely dominant, meaning neither is dominant over the other, what we're going to see is a blending, and red plus white makes pink. So when we breed these two flowers, these two color snapdragons together, we get a pink snapdragon. And I believe these are snapdragons. They could be 4 o'clocks. Let's see. Yeah, snapdragons and 4 o'clocks. Great. So, for example, in some flowers, right, like the example I just gave above, a homozygous red, right, purebred red, is crossed with a homozygous white flower, and it's going to yield a heterozygous pink flower. Now, if neither is dominant or recessive, you're probably thinking to yourself, well, Mr. Reese, what letters am I going to use to represent this? Like, if I use upper and lowercase, I'm going to get confused because that's how I represent dominant and recessive. Well, this is a type of dominance. It's just incomplete dominance. So why don't we just use all capital letters? And we'll see that on the next slide. Don't worry. So this is known, ultimately, as incomplete dominance or non-dominance. No allele is dominant or recessive, but rather they yield to one another and blend together. So since there is no recessive allele, we will only use capital letters. All right. So for example, a red flower would be big R, big R. A white flower would be big W, and a pink flower, the blending of red and white, we'll just make it big R, big W, right? let's keep it simple. Let's not get our wires crossed with incomplete dominance and then dominance and recessiveness, because they're different patterns of inheritance. Okay, so let's do a little example with the Punnett square just so you guys can see that. So if we cross two of these pink hybrids with each other, what kind of plants are the pink plants going to make? Well, let's put them in a Punnett square. So the genotypes of the parents, right? We said that when red was mixed with white, the pink would be RW. So the parents' genotypes are RW, RW, two capitals, because we're still talking incomplete dominance. So just like any Punnett square, let's fill her in. Okay, so we see that we get the genotypes. A quarter of them are big R, big R. 1/2 of them, or 2/4, are RW, and then 1/4 is WW. So what do these three phenotypes, or I'm sorry, these three genotypes correlate phenotypically? Well, we know that RR is red, RW is the pink, and WW is white. So it's really as simple as that, folks. It's no different from what we've been doing. We just need to understand that sometimes in some organisms, dominance and recessiveness is not how it works. And it can work in this fashion as well. It can work in an incomplete dominant form. And a telltale sign is when the offspring are a blended mix of the parents, right? You don't see either trait from the parent specifically expressed, but rather you see a blending. And that's what tells us it's incomplete dominance and to do it this way. I'll talk to you guys about codominance in the next one.